Hi everyone, welcome back, and this is part 3 of 3 on the screencast on overpopulation, population issues overall, and we are continuing now covering the work of Lara Braff in Mexico in the context of state policies regarding fertility and reproduction overall. Some of the other narratives that came out from women that Braff was interviewing, one of the other major themes was that urban poor women were seen as unfit mothers, particularly by those that were well off or well-to-do, essentially more wealthy individuals were looked at as more fit mothers. So Dolores, who considered herself to be middle class, quit her job in order to alleviate the stress that was keeping her from conceiving. Of course, this is a very privileged type of position here. And she notes in an interview with Braff, why do the poor have them if they cannot care for them? I don't know if you've ever been there, but around the market there have been all these prostitutes and street kids. You look down the alleys, and the children are sniffing glue, the yellow kind. It seems horrible. Or you hear about on the news how children are being thrown into the trash or left in hotels. You hear those stories all the time, and it makes you wonder, why have a child if it's not going to be cared for? And so here, there are particular examples that are highlighted in news stories about particular individuals, and then that essentially means this idea of stereotyping means that entire population of the urban poor basically seen as unfit parents overall. So this really ties into issues of social differentiation and social inequality along class lines in urban areas. So finally, in the last part of the screencast here, we're going to take a look at the work of Robert Manners, and this comes from his work from 1981 journal, Care and Capacity in the Politics of Overpopulation, drawing from the work of cultural ecology. And just to start off here, the essence of Manners' argument is he's essentially refuting the work of Paul Ehrlich. Remember, Paul Ehrlich was saying basically any country that cannot supply its material needs, and particularly in terms of food, is overpopulated. And Manners is writing in critique of that idea. This is something that students at times mistake, that Manners is actually writing in support of Paul Ehrlich. Manners does highlight some aspects of Malthusian / Ehrlich's ideas about overpopulation, but he does so in order to refute those. So the framework within which Manners considers this is cultural ecology. He learns this by and from his mentor Julian Stewart, and then applies it, and we'll cover a little bit more on this in the environment section. But cultural ecology is the study of the process by which a society adapts to its environment. This requires an examination of societies and social institutions with one another, as well as the natural environment. So Manners' 1981 work notes that technological optimists essentially believe that no one has to starve if nobody else wants them to. Food production is outstripping population growth, and quantities of food and money needed to eliminate hunger are relatively small in relation to other issues. We can see some of the expenditures in terms of military expenditures that we'll get on and talk about more later in this class as a particular contrast to some of this. So overpopulation international accounts as those areas or states that do not produce enough food to provide for all their people. This is essentially this idea of version of isolated states. So this is coming directly from the work of Paul Ehrlich, right? Situating the story of overpopulation from the overcrowded urban areas in India during the monsoon season. So this idea of physical crowding, discomfort, these sorts of things. This also implies, of course, that in a globalized world, you cannot buy or exchange services and or commodities for the foods that are needed. And of course, this is not true, right? I mean, we see that, and we'll see this in later sections on food production, that in the United States, for example, very few states provide anywhere upwards of 5 or 10% of the food that they actually consume, the population in that state. So humanitarianism, again, these arguments for these future generations, right? Reduce numbers of overpopulated areas. So this is, again, Paul Ehrlich has a very top-down idea, common control system, United States with the United Nations, basically controlling other countries and holding their populations in check. Today, global interdependence and reliance on imported goods can be utilized to provide for needs. Again, this is our globally connected world. Now, of course, that does have consequences in terms of things like supply chain, things like food miles, and then it does potentially produce vulnerability where we see supply chains extended out in a global market, in a global context that can be disrupted not only by inability to hire workers, but also, as we're seeing with Russia's war in Ukraine, essentially disrupting potentially global food supplies in terms of one of the breadbaskets of the world in Ukraine. So the global condition is not by numbers, but by inappropriate channels of distribution. And this is something that we will come to again and again, particularly in the section on global food security and hunger. Cultural changes needed as realistic alternative to diebacks now in order to avoid dieback later. Manners takes all of these ideas. In the end, he concludes by noting that hopeless causes are not the exclusive property of impractical dreamers and mindless fanatics. They are sometimes embraced by those who despair about a hopeless present. And if the choice of causes offered does indeed lie between starvation to achieve this chimeral population balance, and which, again, he's saying basically doesn't exist, and cultural changes that could liberate our technologies, likely a potential for feeding all the people now and into the foreseeable future, I think most of us would opt for the latter. If their so-called third choice, the immediate implementation of a drastic and worldwide birth control program to avert dieback now while yielding zero population growth in a couple generations, if such a program were indeed more feasible than the cultural changes suggested, it would still require distributional reforms during the interim period. And again, here's a direct critique. He's basically saying that Paul Ehrlich's idea is not going to work, or it would still require these cultural changes that he's calling for in the context of his article. And those two would demand the kind of economic, political, social, ideological adaptations that alone could overcome the present effects of maldistribution. So to bring it back around again for overall what we're going for in the series of screencasts associated with the course materials on the course D2L page is, to consider, are we in the midst of a population crisis? And think about how we utilize that word. Think about Thomas Malthus writing that in 1798, Paul Ehrlich writing this for the first time in 1968, and the various iterations they both went through as they revised, this idea of this end of days story and what needed to be done. And essentially, ultimately for Ehrlich, more of a justification for increased hierarchy, top-down paternalism, and control of individuals. And so there's real questions here of power in terms of how social inequality is potentially exacerbated by some of these things which are supposedly done in the best interest of all of humanity. And of course, this is a theme that we will touch on over the course of the entire semester. So we, as background for this, in this particular global or world problem, we've covered early population theorists and ideas about population from ecology, including carrying capacity. We've looked at the population bomb, Paul Ehrlich's work, and drawing from the work of Thomas Malthus and others. We've looked at the demographic transition and some of its implications for how states might manage their population to not only curb the number of individuals being born, as well as the population overall, but also in some instances to promote population growth, as we see in a number of countries by various policies overall.